This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Pelikan Edelstein Moonstone. I'll be testing it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'm going to begin with my Pilot 78G Plus with a stainless steel extra fine nib. I've had mixed results with this needle point fine nib, so we'll see how it does on this Tomoe River paper. Feels good so far. Yeah, this isn't bad. I don't feel it catching in the paper. I am going to say, yeah, I'll go ahead and say that it's nice. Not only is it not scratchy, but I say that it's nice, but looking at it with it being kind of a medium gray, the legibility of it on this paper is not great. It doesn't spread out any at all. It maintains that very fine line, so, but it felt nice. Next, I have a Quebeco Skyline Sport, also with the extra fine nib, but this is a German extra fine nib. And this is nice. It's odd, I'm feeling some feedback, more feedback on this paper than I did on the other two writing samples that I'll talk about in a minute. But you can see how much broader of a line it's putting down. But I am feeling like a pencil-like feedback. I'll go ahead and... I like the amount of ink that it's putting down, and I like the line width. I'll go ahead and say that that's nice. And this is a good ink to go with this gray Skyline Sport. Next, I have my Lamy Studio. Now this Studio came with a gold extra fine nib. I have put that gold nib in my Lamy logo, and I have this is a Lamy fine nib that I keep in this pen. Usually whenever I'm doing Lamy writing samples, I like to use my CP1. That's a popular pen for people, but I'm having some issues with it, and I think it's because I've been switching nibs back and forth in it. This has the same feed that the CP1 does, so this fine nib would write like a fine nib would in a CP1 or in a Safari or the aluminum version, any of this style of stainless steel nib. Now, I haven't been that fond of this ink and nib combination on other papers, but on this Tomoe River, this is nice. It's putting down a suitable amount of ink. It's a little bit drier than the Quebeco Sport was, but it didn't feel dry on this paper. Next, I've got my Twsbi Mini that's also a fine nib. This is usually a very smooth nib. But it feels a little dry with this ink. It doesn't feel unpleasant, but it does feel dry. I liked the Lamy Studio better than this one. That surprises me. Next, I have a Sailor LeCool. This has the same style nib that you would find in a Sailor Compass. Sometimes it's called a Sailor 1911 Junior or a Prophet Junior, I believe. And, well, let me see. This is a medium fine, but it's, and I'm pretty sure the Sailor Compass that's out right now only comes in a medium fine. I would say on this paper it feels, I wouldn't say that it feels nice. It just feels okay. I've talked about this many times, but the shape of this nib, I don't know. I don't like the way it feels with on most papers. You do get the occasional ink and paper combination that I like, and I'll be talking about that on one of the other writing samples, but I like the way this gray and quartz color look together. Next, I've got my Platinum 3776 with a medium nib. I like this one. There's a significant amount of feedback. I didn't do my little loop-de-loops. But I like this. I'm going to say it's nice. But there is quite a bit of feedback. But I do like it. Next, I've got my Pilot Stargazer with a medium nib. This is a pretty wet writing nib. And it's typically very smooth, and yes, it is very smooth. And that is smooth. And next, Pilot Metropolitan with a cursive medium nib. This is typically a pretty dry writer. Yeah. This is unpleasant. It's so dry. It feels like it's running out of ink. Look at the difference between those two. This is just too dry. The legibility's not that great. And finally, the 1.5 stub. And when this is such a low saturation ink, when you wipe the little X, do the little smear test, it nearly wipes completely away. Okay, I'm going to let that dry a little bit. This is Tomoe River paper, what I typically consider the best fountain pen friendly paper for seeing all the characteristics of an ink, its sheen and its shading. This is Rhodia, also a very good paper, but I don't usually see sheen. If an ink has sheen, I don't usually see it on this paper. On this paper, my favorite was the Skyline Sport. I loved it. It was so enjoyable to write with. Now, the Pilot Stargazer was very smooth, and it was very wet and put down a lot of ink, but to me it was almost like too smooth. I really liked it, and it was enjoyable to write with, but between these two, the Skyline Sport was my favorite. Now, I've done writing comparisons between my Skyline Sport and my quebeco Lilliput. They both have an extra fine nib, and it's It's the same size nib, but my lily put writes a lot drier, so I don't know if that's the case with all of the quebeco nibs. You know, I do hear people that have bad experiences with their quebecos, and so I don't know if it's just that inconsistent across all the lines, but my Skyline Sport wrote beautifully, and just so enjoyable. Now for my low quality paper, I've got 20-pound copy paper, and a lot of these pens, they were nice, some were okay. I was kind of surprised by the 78G. It was nice. It wasn't scratchy. It didn't feel dry. And I think it's because, look at the X's. This ink just soaks into the paper very quickly. And I think it spreads out just a little bit. And I don't know, this ink just performed really well with that extra fine nib. It soaked in and dried quick enough that it didn't catch on the paper. Now, the Stargazer and the wetter pens was just too wet. There was a fine line, not really a fine line. Most of these pens were either a little too wet or a little too dry. They were okay to write with, but my favorite this time was the Sailor LeCool, and that just surprised me. Normally, that nib feels like it's lumpy or lopsided, or there's something just not quite right with it. But on this paper, it was smooth, it wrote nicely, it had just the right amount of wetness. You can see almost all of these bled through from one degree to another. Now the really dry Metropolitan didn't bleed through, but it wasn't that pleasant to write with. The Sailor LeCool didn't bleed through hardly any at all. And it was a nice pen, ink, and paper combination. I'm sorry about that. Next, in my Leuchtturm, my little writing sample, it's just a nice, Moonstone is just a nice gray ink. It's nice and flat, kind of velvety. You can see it's not very saturated when you write and do the smear test. It's almost completely gone. But it's a nice looking ink. And finally, back to the Tomoe River. I'm not seeing any sheen. There's some nice shading with some of these nibs. On the Tomoe River, I would have to say, even with the feedback, I really liked the platinum. The Stargazer was almost a little too wet and a little too sloppy. I still liked it. It was my second favorite, I would say. But the Platinum Medium was my favorite. I liked the feedback. Gave me some control as I was writing. All right. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.